Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books in Bytes. Today we're going deep on a book. Well, it looks at a really turbulent time in German history, but through a fascinating lens. The world of business in Hamburg.
You're talking about Paper and Iron, Hamburg business and German politics in the era of inflation, 1897, 1927, right?
It's by Niall Ferguson.
That's the one. You know, it's easy to get lost in the big sweeping narratives of war and revolution. But this book zooms in on the experiences of industrialists, bankers, shipping magnates, the people who kept the wheels of the German economy turning.
Yeah, and what I find really compelling about this approach is how it reveals the complex interplay between economics and politics. We see how business interests shaped government policies and how those policies, in turn, affected the fortunes of businesses and individuals.
It's a two-way street. So for our listener today, what would you say are the major themes running through the book? Well, first and foremost, it's a story about adaptation and survival in the face of extraordinary challenges. We're talking about two periods of intense inflation, the First World War, the political and social upheavals of the Weimar Republic. It's a roller coaster ride. And Ferguson uses Hamburg, this vibrant port city, as a microcosm to explore how these events played out on a human level.
Okay, that makes sense. Hamburg was and still is a major hub of global commerce.
Exactly. It was home to some of Germany's most powerful companies and financial institutions, shipping lines like Hapag, shipyards like Blohm & Voss, banks like Warburg & Co., all actors who played a significant role on the national stage. And within Hamburg itself, you had a very distinct social hierarchy, with a small but immensely powerful business elite at the top.
So how did this elite navigate the turbulent waters of the early 20th century? That's what I'm really curious about.
That's the heart of the book. And it's a story filled with twists and turns. Ferguson takes us through the golden years, before the First World War, a time of incredible economic expansion for Hamburg, fueled by the shipping industry, shipbuilding, and the growth of global trade. But even during these boom times, there were signs of trouble brewing.
What kind of trouble? Were there already economic warning signs?
Not necessarily in the classic sense, but remember, this period saw the rise of social democracy in Germany. And Hamburg was no exception. Labor movements were gaining strength. And there were major strikes, like the dock worker strike of 1901, that hinted at the growing tensions between labor and capital. Ferguson argues that the seeds of future conflicts were sown even during this era of prosperity.
That's a point that often gets overlooked. Even in the so-called good old days, there were always underlying currents of change, and often discontent.
Precisely. And those currents become impossible to ignore once we hit 1914 and the outbreak of the First World War.
Talk about a turning point. I imagine the war completely upended life in Hamburg.
Absolutely. It was a shock to the system, no question. The British naval blockade, for example, immediately disrupted the flow of goods and trade that Hamburg relied on. Ferguson describes the panic on the Hamburg Stock Exchange. When war became imminent, it's a vivid illustration of how quickly the world changed.
I remember reading about the Tram family in the book. A wealthy, influential family in Hamburg. Even they felt the impact of the war in a very personal way.
That's a great example of how Ferguson weaves individual stories into the broader narrative. The Schrams, despite their wealth and status, had to contend with rationing, declining living standards, and the anxieties of a nation at war. It's a reminder that even the elite were not immune to the disruptions and hardships of wartime.
So on the one hand, you have this external shock of the war, but then you also have internal divisions within the German elite about how to respond to the crisis.
That's an important point. The book highlights how the war exposed these fault lines. Within Hamburg's business community, you had figures like Max Warburg, a prominent banker, who initially embraced what was called war socialism, the idea of a centrally planned economy to support the war effort.
That's fascinating. It seems counterintuitive that someone from the business world would support such a strong role for the state.
It speaks to the sense of national unity and urgency that gripped Germany in the early days of the war. But as the conflict dragged on and the economic consequences became more apparent, Warburg and others like him began to have second thoughts.
So this initial unity starts to crack under the pressure of war.
Exactly. And you see these divisions play out in the debates over Germany's war aims and strategies. Warburg, for example, became increasingly critical of the government's handling of the war and argued for a negotiated peace settlement. But then you had figures like Richard Krogman, a powerful shipping magnate who remained a staunch supporter of the war effort and advocated for a more aggressive approach. It really shows you how war can fracture even the most seemingly unified groups. And those fractures only widened with the war's end in 1918 and the turmoil that followed.
Germany was in a state of chaos, right? Revolution, political instability, economic uncertainty. It must have felt like the world was falling apart.
It was a truly revolutionary moment. Think about it. The Kaiser abdicated, the old order was crumbling, and workers' and soldiers' councils were springing up across the country, challenging the authority of the traditional elites. Hamburg, of course, was caught up in this whirlwind.
I imagine Hamburg's business leaders were watching these developments with a mix of fear and apprehension.
Absolutely. They were terrified of a Bolshevik-style revolution sweeping through Germany and wiping out their wealth and power. And, Ferguson does a great job of capturing the anxiety and uncertainty they felt during this time. He quotes one prominent businessman who described the situation as a dance on a volcano.
That's a pretty evocative image. So how did they respond to this revolutionary threat? Did they just hunker down and wait for the storm to pass?
Some did, but others took a more proactive approach. Max Warburg, for instance, emerged as a vocal advocate for a more democratic and inclusive Germany. He believed that the best way to prevent a communist takeover was to address the legitimate grievances of the working class and integrate them into the political system.
So he was advocating for reform from within, as opposed to a reactionary crackdown.
Exactly. He was trying to steer Germany towards a more liberal and democratic path. But of course, he faced opposition from those who saw any concessions to the working class as a dangerous, slippery slope.
And then, on top of all this internal turmoil, Germany had to deal with the Treaty of Versailles. That must have felt like a punch in the gut.
It was a devastating blow. The treaty imposed heavy reparations on Germany, essentially holding them financially responsible for the war and for Hamburg, which relied so heavily on international trade. The treaty's restrictions on German shipping and commerce were a major setback.
It seems like the treaty, rather than bringing closure to the war, actually created a whole new set of problems.
It absolutely did, and it fueled a lot of resentment and anger among Germans who felt that they were being unfairly punished. It also created a huge economic burden. That made it extremely difficult for Germany to recover from the war.
Did Hamburg's business leaders try to push back against the treaty? They were influential figures, after all.
They did. In fact, some of them played a key role in trying to mitigate the treaty's impact. They used their connections and economic clout to argue that the reparations were simply too onerous and would cripple the German economy. Karl Melchior, for example, a prominent banker, warned of an export flood, the idea that Germany would be forced to flood the market with cheap goods to generate the revenue needed to pay reparations.
That makes sense from an economic perspective, but did it make any difference politically?
Initially, there was some sympathy for their arguments, especially as the Mark IV began to depreciate in value. But ultimately, the German government adopted policies that contributed to further inflation and economic instability.
So despite their best efforts, these business leaders couldn't prevent the economic catastrophe that was brewing?
That's right. And this is where we see the limits of their power. They could lobby, they could make persuasive arguments, but they couldn't control the larger political and economic forces that were at play.
The book describes a brief period of relative stabilization between 1921 and 1922, before the hyperinflation really took hold. Was that just a false dawn? A temporary reprieve before things went completely haywire?
It was a fragile and fleeting moment of hope. You had foreign investment starting to trickle back into Germany, fueled by speculation that the Allies might eventually ease the reparations burden. And within Hamburg's business community, there was this persistent belief that the Treaty of Versailles was economically unsustainable and that the Allies would be forced to renegotiate.
So they were clinging to this hope that things would somehow work out in the end.
They were, but that hope was misplaced. The underlying economic problems remained unresolved, and the belief that the treaty was unsustainable proved to be wishful thinking. And by 1922, Germany was spiraling towards hyperinflation.
And this hyperinflation, as we know, had a devastating impact on German society.
It was an economic and social catastrophe. Prices were doubling, or even tripling every day. People's savings were wiped out. Wages couldn't keep up with inflation. And the middle class was particularly hard hit. There's this famous passage in the book where Ferguson describes someone having to bring a wheelbarrow full of cash just to buy a loaf of bread. It's a powerful image that captures the sheer absurdity of what was happening.
It sounds like something out of a dystopian novel. So how did Hamburg's business leaders fare during this period? Did they manage to weather the storm?
Some did better than others, but everyone felt the pain. Many businesses struggled to cope. with the volatility and uncertainty. They couldn't plan, they couldn't invest, and they couldn't predict what was going to happen from one day to the next.
It must have been a nightmare to try and run a business in that environment.
It absolutely was. And it's important to remember that this wasn't just about economics. The hyperinflation had profound social and political consequences. It fueled social unrest, eroded public trust in the government, and created fertile ground for extremist movements.
We can see how an economic crisis of this magnitude can spill over into the political realm.
Absolutely. And this is where we see the story of Hamburg's business elite take another dramatic turn.
What do you mean?
Well, as the crisis deepened, the French occupied the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland, in 1923. This was intended to force Germany to pay reparations, but it backfired spectacularly. It crippled the German economy and pushed the country to the brink of collapse.
So the French occupation actually made the situation even worse.
It absolutely did. And it also galvanized a lot of Germans who saw it as a humiliating national insult. But what's interesting is how this crisis forced a change in strategy for Hamburg's business leaders.
In what way?
Well, up until this point, many of them had supported the government's policy of passive resistance to the Treaty of Versailles, but the Ruhr occupation made it clear that this strategy was no longer tenable.
So they had to come up with a new plan.
Exactly. And they realized that the only way out of the crisis was to negotiate a settlement with the Allies and stabilize the German currency. So we see figures like Max Warburg taking on a new role. They become intermediaries, diplomats, working behind the scenes to find a solution.
It sounds like they were putting their own necks on the line.
Yeah.
Trying to bridge the gap between Germany and the Allies.
They were taking a huge risk, and they were doing it because they believed it was the only way to save Germany from complete economic and political collapse.
It's fascinating to see how these business leaders, who had once been symbols of wealth and power, were now trying to navigate this incredibly complex and dangerous situation.
It's a real testament to their adaptability and resilience.
So what happened next? Did their efforts succeed? Did they manage to pull Germany back from the brink?
Well, they did, but it was a long and arduous process. They played a crucial role in helping to create a new stable currency, the Rentenmark, and in restructuring Germany's reparation payments through the Dawes Plan.
So it sounds like they were instrumental in putting Germany back on the path to economic recovery.
They were, and it's a reminder that even amidst chaos and crisis, there are individuals who step up and work to find solutions.
What's fascinating to me is how this whole experience, this brush with hyperinflation, really shaped the mindset of German business leaders and policymakers in the years that followed.
Absolutely. It instilled in them a deep-seated aversion to inflation and a commitment to financial stability. That legacy is still felt today in Germany's economic policies and even in its cultural attitudes.
You know, thinking about the broader themes of the book, it strikes me that one of the key takeaways is this idea that economic power doesn't necessarily translate into political control.
That's a great point. We see this throughout the book. Hamburg's business leaders had enormous economic clout, but they often struggled to exert real political influence, especially during times of crisis. They couldn't just dictate terms or buy their way out of trouble. They had to negotiate, compromise, and adapt to a changing political landscape.
So even in a city like Hamburg, where the business elite held so much sway, they still had to operate within the constraints of a larger political system.
Exactly. And that system was itself undergoing a period of profound transformation. The Weimar Republic was a fragile democracy, beset by internal divisions and external pressures. It's no surprise that business leaders found it challenging to navigate this new political reality.
Another theme that really stood out to me was the importance of adaptability.
Yes, the individuals and institutions that were able to adapt to the changing circumstances were the ones that ultimately survived and thrived. Think about Max Warburg. He started out embracing war socialism, then became a vocal critic of the war, and ultimately played a key role in stabilizing the German economy. He was constantly evolving, responding to new challenges, and that's what allowed him to remain a force to be reckoned with throughout this tumultuous period.
It's a powerful reminder that in times of uncertainty and change, the ability to adapt is essential.
Absolutely. Those who clung to outdated ideas or refused to compromise often found themselves on the losing side of history.
As we wrap up this deep dive into paper and iron, what's one final, provocative question that you think our listeners should ponder as they reflect on the book?
Well, I think it's worth considering the parallels between the era of inflation discussed in the book and our own time. We live in a world of unprecedented economic uncertainty, with rising inflation, geopolitical tensions, and a global pandemic that has upended so much of what we took for granted. So the question is, what lessons can we learn from Germany's experience in the early 20th century? And how can we apply those lessons to navigate the challenges we face today?
That's something for all of us to think about. It's a reminder that history, even the distant past, can offer valuable insights and perspectives on the present.
It certainly can. And I think Paper and Iron does a brilliant job of bringing that history to life, showing us how real people grappled with similar challenges and how their decisions shaped the course of events.
Well, a huge thank you to you for sharing your expertise with us today. It's been a fascinating and thought-provoking journey through a truly pivotal period in German history.
My pleasure. It's always rewarding to explore these historical parallels and to consider their relevance for our own time.
And to our listener, if you're interested in a captivating and insightful exploration of German history, economics, and the complex interplay between business and politics, Paper and Iron is definitely worth a read. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning. And as always, thanks for tuning in to Books and Bytes.